And then I'm going to stop, or I'm going to mute everybody but myself. And then I'm going to start the share. So let's see, we're going to start off with the political end of things. So what I'm calling a conservation in the time of Trump and Biden. Uh, can Trump's damage be undone? What does the future hold? Okay. So yeah, I want to kind of bring us up to today with a little bit of a recap. You know, we've seen significant acreages of federal wildland set aside for conservation purposes. We have quite a few laws on the books, especially from the 1970s, guiding the stewardship of these lands. And we have the agencies with their professionals that are charged with managing these conservation lands. So one way to kind of look at the progression of, kind of who's leading the charge on conservation. We start off with what I'm going to call the rich white men. We have Marsh, Pinchot, and Roosevelt, all from fairly wealthy families. And they had the wherewithal to really promote conservation during their time periods. And then as we go into the early 1900s through the mid 1900s, we have what I'd call the agency scientists, Leopold, Marshall, Carson, and they kind of led the charge, primarily through writing books, through starting organizations such as the Wilderness Society, things like that. And then in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, we go into the grassroots activists, David Brower, Foreman, Abbey. Some were fairly radical, such as David Foreman and Earth First, and some were more with organizations like the Sierra Club, like David Brower, although we went on to form a few other organizations. But what's interesting is now, in the 2000s, a lot of conservation is being pushed by citizens. There's a lot of opportunities, for a citizen that's interested in conservation to join a commission, join a group, go on field trips, and get out there and really push how they think these wildlands should be managed. So an interesting progression. So time-wise, we're going to start in 2016 and go up through today. And as we know, in 2016, Trump was elected president. So, the questions that we pondered then and still ponder now is, are the agencies and institutions dedicated to conservation strong enough to weather the rollbacks that the Trump administration implemented? And can Biden undo Trump's damage? So here's probably a fairly early photo of the administration and the secretaries. So let's look at a few of the secretaries. For the Department of Interior, initially it was Ryan Zinke, who resigned in 2018. Came out of Montana, had gone to school here in Oregon, and like a lot of the appointees, he had numerous investigations questioning some of the things he did. In 2018, one of our bad fire years, Zinke blamed the fires on environmental terror groups, so that that was never proved. He did, though, support aggressive forest management to deal with wildfires, and I think that is a concept that we're carrying forward. Zinke was replaced by David Bernhardt. He was an attorney, worked in Interior during the George W. Bush administration, and his focus was primarily on oil and gas leasing deregulation. And one thing he is known for is he moved the Bureau of Land Management headquarters out of Washington, D.C. to Colorado, which definitely disrupted a lot of families that had homes in the D.C. area. So let's look at the Environmental Protection Agency. Its first administrator was Scott Pruitt, who resigned in 2018 under a cloud of 14 investigations. He had been the Attorney General for Oklahoma, and he had sued EPA in that role, yet he went on to become the administrator of EPA. So kind of the fox ruling the hen house. Some things Pruitt did was he delayed actions on implementing some regulations such as the Clean Power Plan and an ozone rule that came out of the Obama administration. When Pruitt resigned, he was replaced by Andrew Wheeler, another lawyer, and he had also worked for EPA on and off since 1991. And his background was being a lobbyist for coal and uranium interests. The Department of Agriculture, which oversees the Forest Service, Sonny Perdue was its secretary, and he was a veterinarian from Georgia, but he really didn't engage much in natural resource issues. He pretty much stayed on the agricultural side of agriculture of this department. And what we'll see later is it's an undersecretary under the secretary that really oversees the Forest Service. So let me stop the slideshow and see if there's any comments or questions. Bob?
One of the things that Trump should be given credit for was he kept his promise of eliminating the advocates for industry, and instead it removed the middleman and just put industry directly in charge of all these things.
Yeah.
So we didn't need lobbyists anymore. Industry was just giving it directly. And cut out the lobbyists, which is what he promised to do. So
yeah. Anybody else? Okay, well, let's get back to the slideshow and keep moving along. A lot of stuff to cover today. So I will share the screen. Let's see. I love some of these cartoons I found regarding Trump. That's Smokey on the chopping block. So let's cover a few selected events under the Trump administration. So let's look at energy production, the Bundys, and monument review. So regarding energy production, Trump tried to promote additional oil and gas leasing on federal lands, including the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. What's interesting is that when in the Arctic, when some of those lease blocks were made available for bidding, a lot of big oil did not bid on these leases, seeing them as bad for business. That they knew that if the Trump left office, that they'd probably have problems holding those leases. Trump withdrew some rules on reducing methane emissions, which is a byproduct from natural gas development. And I don't know if you know anything about methane, but it's a very powerful greenhouse gas, even more powerful than carbon dioxide. So controlling methane is an important thing. And he tried to open up offshore areas to oil and gas leasing. I think it was off Florida and maybe even Oregon, and lost in federal court on opening up those areas. Trump, campaigned on bringing back coal, and it did not succeed. And here I'd say, it was the marketplace that really determined how much coal we're using. In 2008, 48% of our energy production was from coal, and today it's about 20%. A number of coal companies are going bankrupt. In the Four Corners area, there was this huge generation station, the Navajo generation station, that shut down recently. Although, the negative side of that, it did have some impacts to the Navajo nation and the Hopi tribe. But I know they're working really hard, especially with the new Secretary of Interior, to find better sources of economic development. So let's shift away from energy and talk about the Bundys. So a little bit of background information. This is the patriarch of the Bundy family, Cliven, and he had a permit to graze public lands near Bunkerville, Nevada. And in a protest over the listing of the desert Taurus under the Endangered Species Act, he stopped paying his permit fees in 1995 onwards. And the total of those fees are over $1 million. And, typically for the Forest Service, the BLM, if you're not paying your fee, they need to take action. So the action the BLM took was to attempt to confiscate Bundy's cattle that were on federal land. And that resulted in an armed standoff between the Bundy supporters and the federal government on his property. The standoff got ugly, a lot of weapons there. So the government retreated, but still brought Bundy to federal trial in Las Vegas. But unfortunately, the judge declared a mistrial and dismissed the case due to misconduct on part of the federal government. If I remember correctly, they basically had a mole planted into the Bundy side of the protest and did not disclose that in the trial, and it made the judge pretty mad. Bundy is one of these people that believes the states and not the federal government owns public lands, which is totally wrong. People talk about, giving the federal lands back to the states. Well, the states never had the federal lands. Hopefully, as you learn in this class, that the public domain lands, the federal lands, the federal government then granted to states, to private entities, to colleges, things like that. And he thought they had an inherent grazing right, whatever that means. And so he believed the federal courts had no jurisdiction over his case. More recently and closer to home, we see the Bundys in Oregon. And these are the sons of Cliven Bundy. And again, some background is there's the Hammond family that are ranchers near Burns, Oregon. And they had served some prison time because they had started a fire on federal land, on BLM land. And the original sentence did not meet the sentencing guidelines for how long it should have been. And so they were resentenced to additional time to spend in prison for those fires. There was a rally held in support of the Hammonds in Burns in January of 2016. And the people that participated in that rally then moved en masse to the nearby Malheur Wildlife Refuge to occupy the refuge, again with guns. It was an armed occupation of that refuge, and that was a refuge managed by the Fish and Wildlife Service. And so, similar to Bunkerville, their opinion was the federal government had no legal right to manage these lands, which again was totally wrong. And the occupation ended when one of the protesters was killed by a federal agent. I think they were traveling from the Burns area to John Day, and they were pulled over, the government tried to pull them over, and this one guy kept driving through the snow, and he was shot. But again, the court case failed in court, and here my opinion is that the charge against the Bundys and their cohorts was conspiracy, and that's a pretty hard thing to prove. I think they should have gone for something more easy, such as damage to public property, things like that. But that case was thrown out of court. Here's a picture of Dwight Hammond, the patriarch of the Hammond family, that kind of got this thing whole started. And some of the information on him: he was pardoned by Trump in 2018, and so did not have to serve any more time for starting those fires. And right before Trump left office, his administration attempted to reissue their grazing permits for the BLM land. But fairly soon after Biden came into office, he canceled that renewal and has promised to study the situation. So it'll be interesting to see what really happens if Hammond gets their grazing permit back or not. Now, one thing before we leave the Hammonds and the Bundys is I read in the paper this morning that there's with this mega drought we're experiencing, the farmers in the Tule Lake, Klamath Falls area are receiving essentially no federal water for their farms. And I think it's Ammon Bundy, one of the sons, has said that he's going to travel to Klamath Falls to try to organize some kind of protest. So stay tuned on that.
Hey, John.
Yes.
Didn't there was also an article that they had bought a small amount of land next to one of the major water gates.
That's right. Yes. Some of the anti-government people bought some land by a gate where the water is either diverted to the farms or I think diverted to the Klamath River or Klamath Lake. But yeah, not a good thing. One thing I do need to point out about the Malheur occupation is that Harney County, where that refuge is located, and the community of Burns, they did not participate in this insurrection, and part of it was the refuge folks had collaborated quite intensely with the local community on how the refuge should be managed, how the grazing in and around the refuge should be handled, and so this whole thing did not see local support. And this photo here is a book about that exact thing. I know that the sheriff of Harney County was pretty upset with the occupation, things like that. One thing too I'd point out about the Bundys and Hammonds is that there's a direct connection to the January 6th insurrection at our Capitol. And the insurrectionists, I think they're part of the Proud Boys, the Oath Keepers, probably some other groups. And so they kind of got some of the early start at the two Bundy standoffs. And so with their loss of support in the White House, what does the future hold for them? I know a lot of them are going to be tried for the insurrection at the Capitol, but the ones that didn't participate, kind of stay tuned as to what happens to those groups. So again, I'm going to stop the slideshow, see if there's any questions. Yeah, troubling times. Melissa has a hand raised.
Yeah, just a comment from back in the olden days when I was, I had friends and was working in the forest in the Sierras. And a friend of mine was the range management guy there, and they were having problems back then. This was in the 80s, that a lot of the people who owned those grazing permits had a lot more clout than the guy that was trying to manage them for the Forest Service. And they would go to Sacramento if you tried to keep them from putting their cattle on the meadows too soon or anything else to try and get them to manage it.
Yeah, that's a really interesting phenomena that, of some of the commercial interests that the Forest Service and BLM deal with. It seems that the livestock grazers are the most powerful. And it seems like a lot of county commissioners, county supervisors, congressmen, state elected officials seem to come out of the ranching community, much more than the timber industry. It's an interesting phenomena. And if you remember, early on in the course, we saw a video clip from The Greatest Good where Gifford Pinchot, the first chief of the Forest Service, he had a lot of pushback from the ranchers, because up until the Forest Service being established and the forest coming under regulation, a lot of the grazing folks had basically unrestricted access to public lands for sheep and cattle. And so to get that managed, that was much more tough for the Forest Service than timber harvesting. Anybody else?
And isn't the grazing fee something ridiculously low? I remember hearing that. It's
Yeah, it is. Typically, the fee is based on what they call an animal unit month, or an AUM, which could be a cow, calf, if it's cattle, or for sheep, it might be like 5 sheep. I can't remember what exactly the number is, but I think it's between $2 and $3 per animal unit month. While on private ground, it's probably, I don't know, 5 or 10 times that amount. So, yeah, a federal grazing permit can be a pretty good deal. Although there are some requirements that they have to own a base property. They can't, supposedly overgraze, things like that. All right, well, let's get back to the slides. I think we're going to get into the Biden administration here real soon. Oh, we're getting to monuments, sorry. So yeah, let's talk about monuments for a minute. And if you remember, there's a 1907 law, the Antiquities Act, that allows a president to unilaterally, they don't need Congress, to unilaterally declare a monument. And so for us, close to home, we have the Cascade-Siskiyou Monument, which is 114,000 acres. And I think these protest signs, both pro and anti, occurred because Obama expanded this monument by 48,000 acres when he was president. And so that's why we saw those, and we still see these signs in the community. But let's go back to the last administration, the Trump administration, and he ordered up a monument review. It was by an initiative that was launched in 2017 by executive order. And the order directed the Interior Department to review the designations of national monuments of more than 100,000 acres since 1996. Why that size and why that year, I don't know. So Zinke, who was then the Secretary of Interior, he headed up the review, and they looked at 27 monuments, and Cascade-Siskiyou was one of those monuments reviewed. So the one monument I want to spend a fair amount of time talking about is Bear's Ears. So hopefully you can look at this photo here and see why it's called Bear's Ears. So it was created by Obama in 2016, but Trump issued a proclamation shrinking it in 2017. And so it was shrunk from 1.35 million acres down to 228,000 acres, an 85% reduction. And the Trump action split this large monument into 2 smaller monuments, the Sascha and the Indian Creek. And the effective date was February of 2018. So here's 2 maps that hopefully you can see. And here's the original monument that Obama had declared. And then here's what Trump did. And these cross-hatched areas are these 2 kind of remnants of the larger monument. So again, that was an 85% reduction. And the decision was immediately challenged. The Navajo tribe and an environmental coalition filed suits in the U.S. District Court in the District of Columbia. And their legal argument was that there's no authority under the Antiquities Act to modify a monument. Although Trump's people appointed that Woodrow Wilson during World War I did reduce the size of the Olympic monument, although that action was later reversed and that monument became Olympic National Park. 121 law professors wrote a lengthy letter countering Trump's actions that the 1976 Federal Land Management Policy Act reserved monument adjustments to Congress. So there's no resolution yet. In September of 2018, a judge ruled that the litigants needed to provide notice prior to any ground disturbing activities. So in other words, if there's going to be any drilling or mining timber harvest, things like that. All parties had to be notified. Trump tried to throw the case out of the court in October, and that failed. And so more recently, Biden has vowed to return the monument to its original borders, but I don't think that has happened yet. There was only 2 monuments that were shrunk. So Bears Ears was the first one, and the second one was Grand Staircase Escalante in southern Utah. And that was reduced by 45%. And as with Bears Ears, Biden has vowed to return it to its original boundaries. So, during the Trump administration, there was some significant legislation, believe it or not. So just when you think bipartisanship action is dead, there was the John D. Dingell Conservation Management and Recreation Act, passed by a large number of votes. Bill was quietly signed by Trump. It's one of these omnibus bills that does a lot of things: wilderness, monuments, park expansion. Although what I would point out was that it renewed the Land and Water Conservation Fund. And if you remember that act, it allows federal monies, primarily from offshore oil and gas royalties, to be used for conservation purposes, for buying land, for grants to states, things like that. So even though this bill renewed that act, Trump's 2020 budget did not fund it at all. But we'll see in a minute here that a subsequent act does fund it. And that's the Great America Outdoors Act, which also was signed by Trump in August of 2020. And it secured $900 million a year, mostly for land acquisition for the Land and Water Conservation Fund. And the Park Service was quite happy with this bill because it provides $9.5 billion to address the maintenance backlog in our national parks. So, I guess not all was lost, but again, these things were not heavily touted by the president. So as we leave Trump, we can stop here for a minute before we get into Biden. Okay. See if there's any more questions or comments about the guy that lives down in Florida. Okay, well, let's see what Biden is up to. Oh, Bob, you have something?
Well, I don't know who you're talking about in Florida, but no, I just noticed that when we as a society don't choose to fund something, these backdoor ways of funding it, like mineral rights and oil, or like lumber, letting clearing happen by, where essentially it's paid for by letting lumber companies take the best wood out. It just sets up a motivation system where it's sort of a buy-off, because essentially now we're supposed to be motivated. Anyway, it gives us an interest in the lumber communities and lumber interests, or in the offshore drilling and mining, whatever the heck it is that's being used as a backdoor way to fund something and to try and make it sound like it's not costing us anything, rather than being a choice that we make as a society.
Yeah, that is definitely
puts us in a jam.
Yeah, that's definitely politics. As we talked before about the receipts to states for roads and schools, yeah, that came from timber receipts primarily.
Exactly.
Yeah, the Land and Water Conservation Fund, yeah, it comes from oil and gas primarily. There's some other sources of funding, but nothing nearly as large.
So it creates a local constituency for timber harvesting, right?
And you think about the settlement with the tobacco companies, what those monies were used for. So yeah, what can we say? Barbara, I see you have your hand up.
Yeah, I was wondering who really pushed the diminishing of those monuments? Was it cattle? I mean, it just doesn't look like good cattle land in that area.
Yeah, my guess is primarily mineral interests in
Oh, okay.
Utah.
I read the book Leave It As It Is by Gessner, and he talks about this Bears Ears especially, and it's definitely mining.
Okay.
Yeah, and it's not timber. You know, those parts of Utah just not known for producing very big trees.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. So let's see what Joe Biden is proposing. So I will share the screen one more time. Biden hasn't been in office long enough to get some really good political cartoons going. This was the best one I could find so far. So both during this campaign and coming into office, Biden has outlined some environmental goals, and the primary focus is on climate change. Some other things he's talking about is environmental justice, and there he's talking about that disadvantaged communities, typically poor people of color, that a lot of times they get impacted by projects that not consistent with the impact to the rest of society. He wants to protect biodiversity. And one thing that I see that really does impact the federal lands is this conserve 30% of American lands by 2030. They call it the 30 by 30. And I think he's going to call it the America the Beautiful initiative. Although, the kind of devil's in the details on that initiative. So yeah, what classifies as land conserved? As a forester, I might argue that land subject to timber harvest might be conserved lands. If you're using native species, if you're practicing maybe selective management as opposed to clear cutting, things like that. But someone else is going to define what qualifies as conserved. And then the final thing that he really wants to push is no new oil and gas permits on federal lands. And again, that really fits in with the focus on climate change. Let's look at some of his appointees. First, let's talk about the Department of Interior. Deb Haaland, hopefully I'm pronouncing that right, has been confirmed as the Secretary of Interior. And interestingly, she's a member of the Laguna Pueblo. So she's a Native American from the Southwest, was a congresswoman in New Mexico. And when she was a congresswoman, she did serve on the Natural Resources Committee. So definitely she's highly qualified to be the Secretary of Interior. Because, Interior has the Bureau of Land Management, the Park Service, Bureau of Indian Affairs, Fish and Wildlife Service. So I think that's a good appointment. Secretary of Agriculture is a retread. Thomas Vilsack was Secretary of Ag under Obama, and Biden has appointed him as his Secretary of Agriculture. Although his nomination did see some pushback by the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, because when Vilsack was Secretary of Agriculture, there were some issues over were Black farmers being dealt fairly. Although I've heard that Vilsack has promised to pay more attention to that as he serves at this time. And I kind of referred to this earlier, but in this Department of Agriculture, it's really the Undersecretary for Natural Resources that is the one that oversees the Forest Service. And interestingly, James Hubbard, who occupies that position, he was appointed by Trump, but so far the Biden administration has carried him forward. And it might be because both administrations kind of like his stance. He was the state forester for Colorado, and he very active in the state and private forestry program. As a forester retired with the Forest Service, I do like this quote from Hubbard. Quote, "I think the Forest Service needs to continue to be a land management agency that fights fire, not a fire service that manages land. We're not just a fire department. And I know, you know, in my time with the Forest Service, the percent of funding going towards fire just grew incredibly. And so that what that does is it takes away from the natural resource management. And finally, the Environmental Protection Agency, Michael Regan, hopefully I'm pronouncing that right. He is now the administrator of that. He served most recently as Secretary of North Carolina's Department of Environmental Quality. He's an air quality specialist. He was with the EPA, where he gained a lot of experience dealing with climate change. And he has experience dealing with environmental racism. So I think that is my last slide, yes, for the political part of today's lecture. So I will stop the share there. And we're going to get into wildfire here in a minute, but any other comments or questions regarding the political half of today?
John, did you say, I guess I want to know if the money toward fire is toward fire, putting out fires rather than fire prevention?
Yeah, typically the fire budget is divided up into fire prevention, fuels work, and fire suppression would be the three major branches of that. But by far of those three things, fire suppression, putting fires out, gets the lion's share of the funding.
Yeah.
And a lot of times, you know, as the fire season progresses, the Forest Service and BLM, they have to start shifting funds around.
Yeah.
So they might say, oh, okay, well, we're not going to do Project X because we're going to use that money on fire. So Melissa, I see your hand is up.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out that the Biden administration, they just had an article in the New York Times this morning about them going ahead with the Trump project of drilling in the North Slope of Alaska and producing much oil for the next 30 years.
Ah, that's surprising.
Oh my God. Wow.
It might have to do with getting the Alaska senators to support something.
I don't know what it has to do with, but it certainly doesn't seem to fit his
Yeah.
agenda. His stated agenda, shall we say.
Right. Mark.
It's quasi-political. How plausible do you think it is? People have talked about planting millions of trees to capture the carbon in the next, so many years. How plausible do you think that is?
Well, I think at a glance, it's a good thing, but it's not a panacea. You can't plant. Or I just saw an article yesterday. You can't plant your way out of climate change. It's one piece, but you got to do a lot of other things, such as reduce the amount of fossil fuels. But and then planting trees, you have to be careful. You don't want to be adding to the wildfire risk situation, where you're just creating fuel for a future wildfire. You don't want to be planting non-native species in an area where it should be native. It's so again, the devil's in the details, but just at a broad glance, I'd say, let's plant more trees.
Thank you.
Okay, well, we are now going to shift to wildfire. And so again, I'm going to do a share screen. Hopefully find my PowerPoint. So yeah, this is wildfire, and this will be the rest of today. So wildfire, how did we get here, and is there a way out, or why we cannot win the war on fire? So just kind of a little background on fire. Fires have been around a long time. Mother Nature starts fires. Lightning, volcanic lava flows start fires. Indigenous people, they've been in America for 10 to 20,000 years, and they have been using fire. Very much part of their culture to put fire onto the landscape. Yet what we see is, the Anglo-Americans that have settled the United States, we began to put fires out. Here's a classic photo of the war on fire. You got the helicopter, the dozer, the engines. I think there's a parachute with a smoke jumper coming down there. Definitely, as I've talked before, what we learned in World Wars I and II, we took kind of that military approach and used it with the war on fire. Where we're at with wildfire, it's a two-edged sword. As we learn more and more, we know that fire must be returned to our ecosystems and allowed to play its natural role. Yet, human development dictates that we put out unwanted wildfires to protect life and property. So it is quite the dilemma. And when we put fires out, and we have for the last 100 years, keeping fires off the landscape now just makes future fires that much more damaging. So a little bit of fire background. For firefighters, wildland firefighters, we learn about the fire triangle. And so, fire is driven by, oxygen and heat and fuel. And as a wildland firefighter, what we learn is, the way you can take oxygen away from a fire is you throw dirt on the flames and that'll smother the fire. Or one way to take heat away from a fire is to douse it with water, and that cools it off and reduces the fire. Or again, in wildland firefighting, to get the fuel away, you dig a fire line, you dig down to mineral soil, and so when the fire hits that, it runs out of fuel. But in terms of what we can do proactively to deal with wildland fire, fuel is really the only thing. We're not going to deal with oxygen or heat ahead of a fire on the landscape, but we can deal with the fuels on the landscape. So a little bit of fire ecology 101. Fire is an important ecological process that consumes those fuels, especially in the West. In the West, it's dry. We don't have the decay due to moisture that you would see in the East Coast. And so fire recycles nutrients. It thins the forest when allowed to play its role. A vegetation type is quite important. A fire in a ponderosa pine forest could be quite different from a fire, let's say, in a lodgepole pine forest. And when fire is allowed to play its natural role, you'll see fires of different sizes, a mosaic of burn intensities, where in one spot it might burn up all the canopy, but then in another spot it just creeps around, like in that photo there. And then the last thing in terms of fire ecology is what we call the fire return interval. And that's, how many years would you expect the fire to return to that piece of ground? And we'll have some numbers here in a minute. So here's some fire return interval averages. In the Ashland watershed, just up the hill from where I live, in the mixed conifer forest, we expect to see fire every 10 years or so on average. In the California chaparral in Southern California, you might expect to see fire every 50 years. In the Northern Rockies, where there's a lot of lodgepole pine, you might expect to see fire every 450 years. And in Oregon's mountain hemlock at the high peaks of the Cascade, it might be every 750 years. So this fire return interval is critical to understanding the ecology of a given ecosystem. And let's talk about the types of fire. We need a lot of words to describe fire because not all fires are equal. So first, kind of the umbrella is just wildland fire. So it's any fire burning in a park, forest, grassland, shrubland. And it could be planned or unplanned, human or natural ignition. So that's kind of the overarching thing, is a fire out in the wildlands is a wildland fire. So under that, we see prescribed fire, and that's where humans have ignited the fire, with a drip torch, from a helicopter, or it's a planned ignition. An unplanned and unwanted fire is a wildfire, and thus it's subject to suppression, or we try to put it out. And within the realm of wildfire, we see what's called a megafire. And it's a wildfire so large that typically only a change in weather or fuels will stop it. And it'll cost a lot of money, millions of dollars to fight a mega fire. And then finally, one thing maybe you're not aware of is we have what's called wildland fire use. And that's where on federal lands where we have a natural ignition, typically from lightning, that fire is allowed to burn to achieve some resource objectives in a predefined area. You know, years ago, you might have heard in the news that the Forest Service or Park Service was practicing a let burn. And so the more politically correct term is wildland fire use. So here's a couple of diagrams showing if we allow periodic ground fires in the understory, it stays fairly clean. And so when fire does come through here, the overstory survives. And that's what we want. We want, you know, the forest to stay a forest. We want the larger trees in the forest to be green. While in this second photo here, we've allowed the fuels to build up. And we talk about a fuel ladder, and you have surface fuels of branches and needles and things on the floor, and then the small trees create a fuel ladder. And so in this circumstance, when a fire comes through, it climbs up the fuel ladder and it kills the larger trees. And that's, we don't want that. I mean, you're going to get that in spots, again, creating a mosaic, but you don't want a high intensity burn, you know, killing off 100,000 acres of forest. Not a good thing. And I've already talked about, you know, vegetation's important. Climate is also important. You know, we have a Mediterranean climate here where we have, you know, hot, dry summers and cool, moist winters, which can be different from other climate regimes in the continental United States or the maritime, where maybe you get, you know, rain throughout the summer, but that's not our case. The management history is important. When was it grazed, logged, roaded, and the time since the last fire and the fire before that. And then finally, some physical attributes, aspect, you know, what is it facing north, south, east, west? The slope, is it steep? Is it flat? What are the soils? How windy is it? And wind, especially with the Almeida fire, that was a wind-driven catastrophic fire. You know, I mean, a lot of times what I say now is when the wind's blowing, all bets are off. It really does change things. So first, let's take some comments, and then we're going to take our 5-minute break. So I'll stop the share. So Mark, I see you have your hand up.
Oh, I'm sorry. I need to take it off.
Okay. Bob, do you have?
Yeah, it seems to me that the worst fire danger is what follows clear cuts, particularly if they're planted afterwards, to make it sound like they're replacing the trees. But if what you're planting is a single species, single age forest, much too close together, not enough room for any of them to really thrive. We see that around here, these dense thickets of mostly lodgepole pines. And you can see that those are an incredible fire danger. And because you have removed what would be the mother or parental trees, which would, first of all, be able to survive fire, and secondly, space out the trees that grow under it, because they look as they have to get around, find the sun around the shade of the larger trees. So essentially, you're creating a generation of orphans when you do that. So it seems like addressing the structure of the forest, not just the amount, but the structure of the forest, and the way that a natural forest structure is disrupted by clear cutting and other forest practices would be sort of the first goal of creating a less dangerous forest.
Yeah, if you have a clear cut, there's a progression of the flammability of it. You know, one thing to look at is the remaining fuels after the harvesting. How are they dealt with? Are they left on site? Are they piled and burned? So that adds to the fire risk. But yeah, soon after the trees are planted, if they're spaced too closely, yeah, that young plantation will burn like a brush field. It's quite flammable. But then as it progresses and gets older, if that plantation is managed and thinned and maybe some prescribed fire put back into it, you can reduce the fire risk of that area. But it'd take us a long time. Francis, I see you have your hand up.
Yes, your slide said there was a big difference between lodgepole and ponderosa pine. So I'm curious what that entails. And also earlier when you were talking about like 750 years between some, as opposed to 10 years for the Ashland watershed, for what causes the differences in, I assume you mean that that's the average time in the past between burns.
Right.
And what causes that extreme difference?
Yeah, well, let's first look at the mountain hemlock. That had the 750-year fire return interval. And your hemlock grows in the high Cascades where the winters are long, the summers are short. And so things stay moist quite a while. A really important thing in terms of flammability is the needles that that conifer drops and the fuel bed created underneath those trees. And so a hemlock needle is fairly short, while let's say a ponderosa pine needle is long and much more flammable. So yeah, so the ponderosa pine, lower elevation, that forest dries out quicker. Typically your understory will have like manzanita and other shrub species that are quite flammable. And so that definitely contributes towards that much shorter fire return interval. And lodgepole's in the middle. You know, its needles are fairly short, but you know, and it's definitely in a colder, moister climate, typically. Okay, well, I'm looking at my watch and I have 11:53. So let's come back at 11:58. Started the recording. Going to get into the slides here, and then fairly quickly we're going to see I think one of the best videos on fire. So let's first just look at a couple of slides. So I want to talk about kind of some of the things I see that we've learned so far in terms of wildland fire. That prior to European settlement, lightning fires burned unchecked. Native Americans deliberately set fire for a variety of reasons, cultural, for food, for game management. Your early explorers of the West, such as John Wesley Powell, observed fires burning on the landscape. And land clearing / unusual drought led to the record-setting and fatalities of the Peshtigo fire in Wisconsin in 1871. And also, the big burn of 1910 was drought-driven. So yeah, the 1910 big blowup, and that cemented attitudes that fire was unwanted. And so again, just to repeat, the World Wars gave us a military philosophy and tools to conduct the war on fire. And European experiences and education brought to the New World did not include natural fire. It's a different climate, a different history of forest and wildland management. And so when people like Gifford Pinchot went to Europe, went to France to learn forestry, it wasn't part of the curriculum. It was, keep fire out. And then, the anti-Indian bias of the Western settlers did not give Native American burning any acceptance until recently. And then finally, most of the 20th century was fairly wet. You hear about the old timers talk about, storms that lasted weeks and the floods and the snow up to 10 or 20 feet in the high country, things like that. And so that wet time period gave land managers the false feedback that we could actually keep fire off the landscape. And we know that's not true anymore. A lot of times we try to look back in time to see, well, what did these landscapes look like when there was fire on the landscape, or not much time had passed since we started putting out fire. So one thing I really like is what we call repeat photography. And these photos here are in the exact same location in Yosemite Valley. That's Bridal Veil Falls. And this is in the late 1800s, this one photo on the left. And this photo on the right is the exact same location, because this rock here is this rock here. And so you can see, without fire playing its role on the landscape, you have all these trees moving in, thick, creating just incredible fuel hazard. So here's the video we're going to watch, and it's put together by a guy named Paul Hesberg. He's with the Forest Service up in Wenatchee, Washington. And actually, he gave this presentation in Ashland a number of years ago on the SOU campus. And one thing he talks about that may be a surprise to you, and it was a surprise to me, that, we have an epidemic of trees, more trees than the landscape can support sustainably. And so that's why, in terms of a lot of the fuel reduction work you see in the watershed elsewhere, a lot of it's about, thinning out these thickets of trees and getting to a more sustainable open park-like forest. So let me stop the slideshow, and then we'll go to the video. It's about a 15-minute video, so this will eat up most of the rest of our day here. Okay. And this was given a TED Talk in Bend a number of years back.
Wasn't CJ amazing? Sort of tough to follow. I'm gonna change it up on you, and I'm gonna talk to you about wildfires, something that's near and dear to my heart. As you've probably noticed, in recent years, a lot of western forests have burned in large and destructive wildfires. If you're like me, this western landscape is actually why my family and I live here. And as a scientist and a father, I've become deeply concerned about what we're leaving behind for our kids and now my 5 grandkids. In the US, an area that's larger than the state of Oregon has burned in just the last 10 years. And tens of thousands of homes have been destroyed. Acres burned and homes destroyed have steadily increased over the last 3 decades. And individual fires that are bigger than 100,000 acres, they're actually on the rise. These are what we call megafires. Megafires are the result of the way we've managed this western landscape over the last 150 years and a steadily warming climate. Much of the destruction that we are currently seeing could actually have been avoided. I've spent my entire career studying these western landscapes, and the science is pretty clear. If we don't change a few of our fire management habits, we're going to lose many more of our beloved forests. Some won't recover in our lifetime or my kids' lifetime. It's time we confront some tough truths about wildfires and come to understand that we need to learn to better live with them and change how they come to our forests, our homes, and our communities. So why is this happening? Well, that's what I want to talk to you about today. You see this forest? Isn't it beautiful? Well, the forests that we see today look nothing like the forests of 100 or 150 years ago. Thankfully, panoramic photos were taken in the 1930s from thousands of western mountaintop lookouts, and they show a fair approximation of the forest that we inherited. The best word to describe these forests of old is patchy. The historical forest landscape was this constantly evolving patchwork of open and closed canopy forests of all ages, and there was so much evidence of fire. And most fires were pretty small by today's standards. And it's important to understand that this landscape was open, with meadows and open canopy forests, and it was the grasses of the meadows and in the grassy understories of the open forests that many of the wildfires were carried. There were other forces at work too, shaping this historical patchwork. For example, topography, whether a place faces north or south, or it's on a ridgetop or in a valley bottom. Elevation, how far up the mountain it is, and weather, whether a place gets a lot of snow and rain, sunlight and warmth. These things all worked together to shape the way the forest grew. And the way the forest grew shaped the way fire behaved on the landscape. There was crosstalk between the patterns and the processes. You can see that in dry forests, trees were open grown and fairly far apart. Fires were frequent here, and when they occurred, they weren't that severe. While further up the mountain, in the moist and the cold forests, trees were more densely grown and fires were less frequent, but when they occurred, they were quite a bit more severe. These different forest types, the environments they grew in, and fire severity, they all worked together to shape this historical patchwork. And there was so much power in this patchwork. It provided a natural mechanism to resist the spread of future fires across the landscape. Once a patch of forest burned, it helped to prevent the flow of fire across the landscape. A way to think about it is that the burned patches helped the rest of the forest to be forest. Let's add humans to the mix. For 10,000 years, Native Americans lived on this landscape, and they intentionally burned it a lot. They used fire to burn meadows and to thin certain forests so they could grow more food. They used fire to increase graze for the deer and the elk and the bison that they hunted. And most importantly, they figured out if they burned in the spring and the fall, they could avoid the out-of-control fires of summer. European settlement, it occurred much later, in the mid-1800s. And by the 1880s, livestock grazing was in high gear. And if you think about it, the cattle and the sheep, they ate the grasses, which had been the conveyor belt for the historical fires. And this prevented once frequent fires from thinning out trees and burning up dead wood. Later came roads and railroads, and they acted as potent fire breaks, interrupting further the flow of fire across this landscape. And then something happened which caused a sudden pivot in our society. In 1910, we had a huge wildfire. It was the size of the state of Connecticut. We called it the Big Burn. It stretched from eastern Washington to western Montana, and it burned in a few days 3 million acres, devoured several towns, and it killed 87 people. Most of them were firefighters. Because of the Big Burn, wildfire became public enemy number one, and this would shape the way that we would think about wildfire in our society for the next 100 years. Thereafter, the Forest Service, just 5 years young at the time, was tasked with the responsibility of putting out all wildfires on 193 million acres of public lands. And they took this responsibility very seriously. They developed this unequaled ability to put fires out, and they put out 95 to 98% of all fires every single year in the US. And from this point on, it was now fire suppression and not wildfires that would become a prime shaper of our forests. After World War II, timber harvesting got going in the West, and the logging removed the large and the old trees, and these were survivors of centuries of wildfires. And the forest filled in, thin-barked, fire-sensitive small trees filled in the gaps. And our forest became dense, with trees so layered and close together that they were touching each other. So fires were unintentionally blocked by roads and railroads. The cattle and sheep ate the grass. Then along comes fire suppression and logging, removing the big trees. And you know what happened? All these factors worked together to allow the forest to fill in, creating what I call the current epidemic of trees. Go figure. More trees than the landscape can support. So when you compare what forests looked like 100 years ago and today, the change is actually remarkable. Notice how the patchwork has filled in. Dry south slopes, they're now covered with trees. A patchwork that was once sculpted by mostly small and sort of medium-sized fires has filled in. Do you see the blanket of trees? After just 150 years, we have a dense carpet of forest. But there's more. Because trees are growing so close together, and because tree species, tree sizes, and ages are so similar across large areas, fires not only move easily from acre to acre, but now so do diseases and insect outbreaks, which are killing or reducing the vitality of really large sections of forest now. And after a century without fire, dead branches and downed trees on the forest floor, they're at powder keg levels. What's more, our summers are getting hotter, and they're getting drier, and they're getting windier. And the fire season is now 40 to 80 days longer each year. Because of this, climatologists are predicting that the area burned since 2000 will double or triple in the next 3 decades. And we're building houses in the middle of this. 2 recently published studies tell us that more than 60% of all new housing starts are being built in this flammable and dangerous mess. So when we do get a fire, large areas can literally go up in smoke. How do you feel now about the forest image that I first showed you? It scares the heck out of me. So what do? We need to restore the power of the patchwork. We need to put the right kind of fire back into the system again. It's how we can resize the severity of many of our future fires. And the silver lining is that we have tools and we have know-how to do this. Let's look at some of the tools. We can use prescribed burning to intentionally thin out trees and burn up dead fuels. We do this to systematically reduce them and keep them reduced. And what is that going to do? It's going to create already burned patches on the landscape that will resist the flow of future fires. We can combine mechanical thinning with some of these treatments where it's appropriate to do so and capture some commercial value and perhaps underwrite some of these treatments, especially around urban areas. And the best news of all is that prescribed burning produces so much less smoke than wildfires do. It's not even close, but there's a hitch. Prescribed burning smoke is currently regulated under air quality rules as an avoidable nuisance. But wildfire smoke, it simply gets a pass. Makes sense, doesn't it? So you know what happens? We do far too little prescribed burning, and we continually eat smoke in the summers from megafires. We all need to work together to get this changed. And finally, there's managed wildfires. Instead of putting all the fires out, we need to put some of them back to work, thinning forests and reducing dead fuels. We can herd them around the landscape when it's appropriate to do so to help restore the power of the patchwork. And as you've probably figured out by now, this is actually a social problem. It's got ecological and climate explanations, but it's a social problem, and it'll take us humans to solve it. Public support for these tools is poor. Prescribed burning and managed wildfires are not well supported. We actually all simply want fires to magically go away and take that pesky smoke with them, don't we? But there is no future without lots of fire and lots of smoke. That option is actually not on the table. Until we, the owners of public lands, make it our high priority to do something about the current situation, we're going to experience continued losses to megafires. So it's up to us. We can spread this message to our lawmakers, folks who can help us manage our fires and our forests. If we're unsuccessful, where will you go to play when your favorite places are burned black? Where will you go to breathe deep and slow? Thank you.
Okay, well, that's the video about fire, and hopefully there's some good news at the end of that. I'm going to run through a few more slides, and then hopefully we have some time for a few comments and questions, and then wrap this thing up. So that was Paul Hesberg of Wenatchee. I'm going to go through this pretty quickly. He already talked about the effects of fire suppression, so I really don't need to get into that. And when the wildland does burn, it's hotter, larger, homes burning, lives lost, lots of carbon, which we don't want to see. So some of the solutions he already touched upon. So let me kind of run through these. Collaboration, getting folks involved. It's your forest, it's our forest. We should, and the Ashland Forest Resiliency Project has done quite a bit of collaboration. Manual treatment, before you can prescribe burn area, or maybe that's all you can afford is the manual treatment of reducing the fuels. If there's some value to be gotten to help pay for the work, maybe you do some mechanical thinning. And mastication, it's not mentioned in the video, but definitely in the brushy areas here in Southern Oregon, Northern California, this can be an important thing of reducing the fuel loading. Prescribed fire, of course, keep talking about that. And one thing about prescribed fire, you can do the mechanical work, but there's nothing like prescribed fire to really reduce the hazard. And so that it's just the most important piece. And I also had mentioned this wildland fire use, and this is a photo in the South Sierra Wilderness where actually a fire was allowed to burn through this area. So you can see the black on the trees. Success, the Ashland Forest Resiliency Project, I think is a success. In the Southwest, we look to the San Carlos and Fort Apache Indian reservations where they were impacted by a 2011 fire. And so the reservations took up a much more aggressive vegetation management. And so recent fires coming off national forests actually, laid down when it came on to the reservation. So and we see that time and time again, that if an area is treated correctly, the wildfire will change its behavior when it hits that treated area. Some of the challenges, insufficient scale, we got to treat large areas. And so when we're treating tens and hundreds of acres, it's not enough when we need to be treating hundreds of thousands, if not millions of acres. My experience in the Forest Service was an institutional resistance, not on my watch. What if it gets away? That ruined my career. And then we see, political moratoriums. We never really got into the Yellowstone fires of 1988. But after those fires, which were in a lodgepole pine ecosystem, there was a nationwide moratorium on prescribed burning for a number of years, kind of setting things back. The video mentions public resistance, the need to mitigate impacts where, yeah, we have, these laws that are well-meaning, but it might result in more red tape to actually getting the fuels reduced. And then funding is important. And as Paul had mentioned in the video, homes in and adjacent to the wildlands can slow things down. The challenge is to getting fire on the landscape, that 100 years of fuels build up, changing climate, smoke is a nuisance, risk of escape, money, limited burn windows. With these longer, hotter, drier summers, sometimes the prescription you have to burn an area may be fairly short-lived, which is one reason why we do a lot of mechanical treatment up front. And then just when humans light the match on federal forests, we have to do the environmental analysis, which is a good thing, but it does add to the cost and time. So we have, in my opinion, extremes on both sides. On one side, we cannot log our way out of this problem. On the other side, environmentalists are to blame for blocking logging that would reduce the impacts of fire. So regarding tree cutting, fire by far is the best way to reduce the risk of unwanted fire. However, a lot of times we need a pre-treatment, and sometimes that pre-treatment includes cutting merchantable timber to help pay for the work. Regarding environmentalists, they're an extremely important voice that need to be at the table, speaking for the non-market values, the wildlife, the water, the beauty, the scenic beauty. And the environmental community reminds us that these are public lands set aside for all Americans, not just industry, not just, those that have a permit to use federal lands. And when we look at the numbers, very few federal projects are stopped by environmentalists, and many projects are improved through the constructive feedback. So in my opinion, the tree huggers and clear cutters share a lot of common ground. You know, they both want healthy, sustainable wildlands. And a lot of these wildlands aren't even subject to commercial timber harvesting. So in my opinion, we need both sides. So just like the Pottery Barn, if you break it, you own it. And we broke the environment of our federal wildlands. So we need to put our money where our lungs are. We need to put our money to keep houses from burning up. And so we need to invest in reducing fuels in our communities. You know, what's it worth to not see a neighbor's home burned down? We need to engage counties on the zoning in the wildland urban interface. A lot of money is spent protecting homes during wildfires. And I know here in Ashland, they're trying to work on making fires more, or making homes more fire resistant, both in terms of the building materials and the landscaping around homes. Insurance companies, you know, they have a role to play. You know, should we always rebuild a home that burns in the wildland urban interface? And then finally, we need to be humble that, in the words of Barry Commoner, a famous ecologist, Mother Nature bats last, using a baseball analogy. And so, yeah, you know, nature may throw some things at us that we need to adapt to. And so that is the end of my slideshow. And we have about 5 minutes for any comments or questions. Mark, you have your hand up?
Yes, I had also taken the Living with Fire course at OLLI, and they have a large repository of great materials that they're looking for places to share. And I wondered if I could pass that on to you to share with the group.
Yeah, that'd be great. Send it to me and I can then send it out.
Okay, thank you.
Melissa.
Yeah, when we were talking about this, you know, we're looking at least 100 years of fuel buildup, right? And when we start talking about prescribed burns, how can we, I think we need to stretch that out, at least in terms of climate change. We can't just start burning up 100 years worth of fuel.
Right. Yeah, it's a very difficult thing. That's why probably the pre-treatment is so critical in many of our areas. If you look up in the Ashland watershed, a lot of times the Lomakatsi crews will first go in and hand pile a lot of those fuels, and then they burn the piles, and then maybe a year or two later they come back in and do the underburn, the prescribed burn. And even then, sometimes it gets hot in spots. You know, even after that pre-treatment with the piling and burning, it just shows you how much energy is built up in those fuels.
Yeah, but just in terms of climate change, if we release all that energy at once, it's really
a
problem.
Sally, I see your hand up.
You said, well, the fellow, I forget his name now, the guy who just told us on the TED Talk, that now there's about 2,000 trees per acre as opposed to, what was it before? 100 or 200?
It was probably probably 100 to 200. You know, it depends on the forest.
I mean, that's an incredible. I don't think I have not heard that statistic before. I think that needs to be brought out to help people understand what the problem is. I've never heard that before. Also, anyway, so really what you're talking about pre-treatment, we need to thin a lot of these places. It sounds like logging is something that needs to happen.
Yeah, and a lot of it may be what we call a pre-commercial operation, where there's no value in the trees, and so they cut them. They cut the small trees down. You know, you want to keep your large trees. Your large trees are naturally fire resistant. And then by species, you want to keep your pines, your ponderosa pine, your sugar pine, your incense cedar, but maybe the white fir that's invading, maybe you want to cut more of that. So yeah, it's a complicated thing. Bob.
Well, it's just important to be selective about it, because if it's just looked at, oh, the problem is too many trees, then that's a very wonderful excuse for essentially removing forests. So, and so the important thing is keeping the big trees that are fire resistant because of their bark, but they're also fire resistant because they're self-limbing. You know, they don't have the lower branches die off because they don't get sun.
Mm-hmm.
So it's really important not to let the timber interests use the idea, oh, there's too many trees, let us cut down as much as possible, and that'll be really good for everybody. And to be clear that we need thinning, but we don't need necessarily cutting of the trees that would be most tempting for commercial purposes.
Yeah, the land managers, when they come up with the prescription, they need to be very careful so that it's translated into an on-the-ground timber marking in a project that achieves that. You know, speaking of large trees, there's one thing I wanted to point out. Sometimes when a forest hasn't seen fire in a really long time, the really large trees don't do very well in a prescribed burn. And so a lot of times we send people in ahead of time and they actually rake the duff and pine needles away from the larger trees, because there might be feeder roots in that duff that get killed with the fire. And you know, to do a careful prescribed burn and then see your large trees die is just heartbreaking. So a lot of effort sometimes goes into, you know, saving those larger trees.
So you're saying that's because of fire on the roots and unexposed roots?
Yeah, again, they
I
haven't
wasn't
seen.
aware of that.
Yeah, I saw this definitely in the Eastern Sierra when I worked on the Inyo forest. We had these big Jeffrey pines that
The dry forest. Oh,
yeah. Okay, well, Ron,
One more question. With all the emphasis on getting rid of the smaller trees and the underbrush and all that, what does that mean for the future of those forests becoming tall trees someday?
it means that you have to keep coming in and retreating them. So hopefully you can come in and do a prescribed burn where the flames aren't that high. You know, it's a cool burn, but it maintains that open forest, the large trees, reduces, you know, the branches and needles that have fallen. Because if you don't come in and do repeat treatments, you know, every 10 or 20 years, you're just going to get back to the problem we have today. Sally, Sally, we'll make you the last question.
I'm sorry. I guess I'm hearing a lot of ecologists saying that we need to keep some of those downed logs because the ecosystem, there's so many other animals and insects and whatever that love those downed trees, and so cleaning up on the underbrush. I mean, there seems to be two opposite interests.
Yeah, it really depends on the forest you're talking about. So a dry ponderosa pine forest,
yeah,
you're not going to have that many down logs. Now, on the Olympic Peninsula, in a very wet forest, you're definitely going to have a lot of down logs, and they're going to be like, you know, nursery trees.
Right, yeah, nurse logs. Yeah.
Nurse logs. Yeah.
Okay, but the dry forest, you don't need that stuff. Okay.
Yeah, and again, you know, the challenge is we're not even able to treat a very large percentage of the forest, and so you know, so the presence of snags and down trees, there's still quite a bit out there. So I am going to wrap up because I have to get somewhere at 1 o'clock. Okay. So I want to thank you all very much, and today's being recorded, and I will send out a link to the recording.